Hi, everybody. We're going to hang tight and start in maybe just a minute to give other people a chance to join. As I can see other people are still joining us. So we'll start in about 1 minute. All right, so we can get started. I just noticed the clock behind me, the battery must have died. So please don't pay attention to the time on the clock behind me. All right, so we're gonna get started. We're gonna talk about abstracts today. The first part of the presentation, I'll be talking about the difference between abstracts and executive summaries, just because I know many of you are assigned something called an executive summary. Although in effect, you tend to actually be writing abstracts. So I'll be talking about that a little bit at the beginning, and then I'll really zoom in on abstracts and talk about what we put in them, what their function is, things like that. And for those of you, I think there's a couple of new people, but many of you have been in these workshops before. My name is Charla Rivera, and I'm the director of the Writing Lab. This is the second to last workshop this semester, but don't worry, these workshops will all be repeated in the spring. So if you saw any on the list that you wanted to take this fall, but you just didn't have time or you didn't know about them or anything like that, we will be repeating these same workshops in the spring. So don't worry about that. So we have one more after this, which I believe is about supporting arguments, but we'll jump in today on abstracts. Okay, so, oh, by the way, everyone is automatically muted when you join this Zoom session, just to cut down on the background noise. If you have any questions while we're going through, I do ask that you just type them in the chat. I have my chat box open here. And then at the end, I'll open it to any questions, and you can feel free to unmute yourself at the end. All right, so let's talk about abstracts and executive summary, since I know many of you, depending on your degree program, might be assigned something called an executive summary. And technically, they are different things. So let's jump in. So what is an abstract? An abstract is a summary of your own research in about 300 words, okay? Sometimes you might have to write a shorter abstract if you are presenting at a conference, or if you are submitting something for publishing, you might have to have something that's even shorter than 300 words. But generally, for something that is being submitted as a part of your final project, 300 words tends to be the average of what's expected, okay? The purpose of an abstract is to help others in academia decide whether they want to read your whole study, your whole research or not. I'm sure a lot of you, as you're doing your research, you're reading abstracts as well. You're using abstracts in the same way. There are other uses of abstracts that I'll talk about later, but this is the main one of just kind of giving somebody the general outline, the general summary of what your research was about, and letting them decide whether they want to continue reading or not, okay? An abstract typically includes the overall purpose of the study and the questions you pursued. It will also include the basic design of the study, the methodology of your study, and any of your major findings. So we do kind of put our spoiler alerts in the abstracts. We do kind of spoil the end. And you might possibly also include your interpretations of those findings and the conclusions of them. And we'll talk about these inclusions in a little bit. But generally, it is exactly the summary of your entire work. Like I said, you might even just go by the headings and kind of try to write a quick summary of each of your sections, things like that. But again, 300 words is very, very short. Or it might be required that it's shorter. And some of these sections, particularly the methodology, might be pretty hard to condense into something so small. So we'll talk about some strategies for that in a little bit. Executive summaries, on the other hand, are similar, but they are different. Some way they can actually be longer than an abstract, technically. So an abstract typically is just capped at 300 words. That's almost an industry standard, across industries, I should say. That tends to just be the academic standard of being 250 to 300 words. Executive summaries can actually be much longer. An executive summary technically could be up to 10 pages or no more than 10% of your total pages, whichever one is shorter. The reason for this is that an executive summary, you can tell kind of based on the name that, oh, sorry, we'll skip this part. Based on the name, the executive summary tends to be for, like, let's say you're working as a consultant for a company and you create this, 100-page report. The CEO is probably not going to read your entire report. It's very likely that the CEO would read your executive summary, your 10-page executive summary of your report that might include your recommendations, which might be largely only your recommendations, and then they would pass the full report on to their relevant employees or the relevant department. So exactly what the name sounds like, the audience of an executive summary tends to be the people who hired you to do this study. So they could be the organizational group, the funding entity, the CEO of the company. So just like the name suggests, the executive summary, you're sending it to executives. Versus an abstract where your audience tends to be other academics, okay? So I think one reason why a lot of your professors assign you executive summaries, something that they call executive summaries, is because that's something that you do in your professional life, is write an executive summary. But in practice, if what you are writing is limited to 300 words and is a full just summary of your entire work, then it's probably actually an abstract and not an executive summary, whatever we might be calling it in the assignment sheet. So everything that I'm going to be talking about today is going to be about abstracts, the 300-word summary. So if you are being assigned something like that, regardless of what it's being called, that's what we're talking about, okay? One quick thing, that executive summaries, I kind of alluded to this. Executive summaries always include your recommendations, since a lot of times that's the purpose of what your report was about. An organization hired you to do consulting work to give recommendations on a specific topic. So your executive summary is always going to include recommendations, where an abstract, depending on your research, you may not actually have any recommendations to give, okay? All right, so we're gonna dive into abstracts, the 300-word summary, regardless of what it's being called in your class. So what exactly is an abstract? So an abstract really performs 4 functions, 3 of which are more relevant to us than the last one, but an abstract is a standalone miniature text that gives readers a short summary. So sometimes you may not even read a full study. You may just read the abstract to just get a general sense of what the study is about, and then that's it. It's a standalone text. It needs to be complete in that it has everything about your methodology, your findings, things like that, because it needs to be able to stand alone. This is the one I was alluding to before, and probably the one you are using abstracts for the most in your own research, which is using it as a screening device that helps you decide whether or not you want to read the entire 25-page journal article or not. You read the 300-word abstract, which gives you the sense of whether you want to continue reading. Abstracts also are very useful as roadmaps. So if you are going to read the entire study, it's helpful for you to read the abstract, because then you know what's coming. You know, again, spoiler alert, you know what the results of the study are. So you're reading the abstract to let you know what's coming, so that as you're reading all of the details in the study itself, it's easier to follow because you know what they found in the end, okay? So when you're writing your abstract, be thinking about how it follows the order of your study itself or your paper itself, making sure that it does exist as a roadmap for your readers as well. And this is the last one that's a little less relevant for us in our context, but there are professional abstract writers and professional editors out there, and abstracts do a lot of heavy lifting for indexing when we're talking about journal articles, organizing things by keywords and things like that. So abstracts can exist in that realm as well, but that's really not relevant for us today. Okay, so when in the writing process do you actually write the abstract? For many of you, you're going to be writing it as the very last thing that you write, because you don't know any of your findings until you've done the research. So typically an abstract is the last thing or almost the last thing that you write, because you can't summarize your work until you've written it. In some cases, you might actually write it when you are, closer to being finished with the paper, but maybe not completely finished, because it can help keep you on track with your big picture to make sure that you are staying on track with what you want to say. So if you're finding that maybe you're losing your thought process as you're writing the entire paper, as you're getting close to the end, it might help to take a step back and actually write the abstract so that you can reclaim your focus. But typically it is something that you write near the end of the research and writing process. Okay, so let's talk about style, like the writing style of an abstract. I really wish that I could give you a hard and fast rule that all abstracts tend to follow a certain formula, but unfortunately it really does vary by field. So what I can do today is talk to you about how you can read different abstracts in your field and kind of glean some of the information that will help you write your own abstract, because there does tend to be certain field specific style usages in abstracts. Okay, so make sure that you take some time to pay attention to the abstracts in journal articles that your professor might be assigning to you, or that you're finding in your own research, and pay attention when you're reading these to note the length. I'm saying 300 words, but in some fields it might be shorter. Okay, and it might even depend by journal. Like certain academic journals might always say, okay, we have 200-word abstracts. They might assign their own limits, right? So just pay attention to the length. And again, if it's over 300 words, if it's multiple pages, then we're talking about an executive summary. Okay, so just pay attention to the length, what shows up in your field. Verb tenses. A lot of times I find that research tends to be written in present tense, at least in the abstract, and I'll give you an example in a few minutes, but it can vary by field or it can vary by topic. So just kind of pay attention. Is this being written as if the research exists in the past, or is this being written as if the research exists today? And that can depend. Whether citations are included. Some fields include citations in their abstracts, where other fields do not include citations in their abstracts. So just pay attention again, read the abstracts in your own field, see if any in-text citations show up or not in the abstract itself. Again, another stylistic choice is whether you can say first person, like we found that, That might be a little more common in some fields than others. And then other fields might be more likely to use meta-discourse, which is words that talk about the paper. This paper will examine This research found blah, 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 blah. That kind of thing. So it really, again, depends by field. Also, you might also just want to check with your professor, because some professors are very sensitive to the use of first person and never want to see it. And other professors might feel the same way about this paper, although like the meta discourse. Although I will say that it's more likely that your professor is sensitive and doesn't like first person than it is that they are sensitive and don't like meta discourse. But definitely check with your professor if you're not sure. You can also ask your professor about any of these in terms of your field. Again, I wish I could give you a hard and fast rule of what abstracts are always like, but unfortunately there's a lot of genre changes here based on your field. The last one is whether or not acronyms or abbreviations are used in abstracts. Some fields will use acronyms or abbreviations commonly in their abstracts, and then other fields will spell things out to not leave anything up in the air for questioning for your readers. So for example, in my field of teaching English, especially teaching English as a second language, there are very common acronyms like ESL, or we might say L1 for someone's first language. Those show up in abstracts all the time. We use acronyms and things like that in our abstracts. But in your field, that may not be the case. So you'll want to pay attention to whether you're seeing acronyms or abbreviations. So here's an example abstract. So let's practice. And so I'm saying you need to read abstracts in your field. Let's actually practice reading this abstract and answering questions about it so that you can get some practice in answering these questions for when you move on to your own abstracts in your own field. So here we have, and I guess I'll just read it to you, it won't take too long, an abstract talking about whether democracy improves welfare of the poor or not. Okay, so many scholars claim that democracy improves the welfare of the poor. This article uses data on infant and child mortality to challenge this claim. Cross-national studies tend to exclude from their samples non-democratic states that have performed well. This leads to the mistaken inference that non-democracies have worse records than democracies. Once these and other flaws are corrected, democracy has little or no effect on infant and child mortality rates. Democracies spend more money on education and health than non-democracies, but these benefits seem to accrue to middle and upper income groups. Sounds like an interesting study. I'd actually like to read that one. But let's look at it critically for some of our questions here. And you'll notice that all of the sentences are numbered. So let's look at this. You can type in the chat your answer, okay? So of this abstract that I just read to you and that you see on your screen here, what do you think is the key sentence, the main point? If you were going to take away one main point from this abstract, what would that be? Which sentence number? Generally, I wait about 15 seconds, 15 to 30 seconds before I respond to what I see here. Great. I would agree with the answers that are here. I think it's kind of a toss-up between sentence number 4 or sentence number 5. I think, you know, number 4 is talking about the flaws of past studies, where number 5 is talking about what this study actually found. So I can see an argument for either 4 or 5 being the key main finding of this study. Okay. Now looking at this abstract, what tense are we talking in here? Past, present, future. You don't need to be a grammar expert and give me anything more specific than that. But what tense are we talking in here? Yeah, absolutely. We're talking in the present tense. Many scholars claim, this article uses, okay? So here we're talking about in the present tense for this particular type of study. Do you see any citations or references in this abstract? You know what? Actually, I should highlight this. Great answer here from Penny. So it looks like we have, and I should have noted this, you can see there's a little superscript next to mortality and next to flaws in questions, in sentences 2 and 4. Those seemed like they would point to a citation. But in fact, this is from a textbook, and the textbook is actually explaining some vocabulary here. So the A and B that we see in superscript is not actually a citation. So I should have told you that. But if you were just looking at this without knowing the textbook, this absolutely looks like it has a citation, but it does not. So there are actually no citations or references, no specific references being used in this abstract. The abstract does refer to other studies in a general sense, saying cross-national studies tend to, so we do know that in this study they're going to refer to other studies, but none of them are specifically referenced in this abstract itself, okay? All right, the next question, is this written in first person, we, I, or is there meta discourse? Meta discourse being like this research found, that kind of thing. Yeah, we got meta discourse here. So you can see in sentence number 2, this article uses data, okay? You could, if this were a different field, you could write this in first person. You could say, we used data on infant and child mortality, da, 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 da. That would be perfectly acceptable in some fields and not in others. Okay, so in this particular study, I don't know if we can generalize this to an entire field because this is only one abstract. But in this particular study, they're using meta discourse. Finally, do you see any acronyms or abbreviations in here? Yeah, there's no abbreviations, there's no acronyms. Again, you're going to want to read more than one abstract for your sample and ask yourself these same or similar questions as you read, because one example abstract doesn't necessarily give you the entire information about the entire field in general. So read a few abstracts, think about these questions as you're reading them, and that will help you figure out what style you should be using for your own field. Okay, and when in doubt, ask your professor. That's always going to be my answer. When in doubt, ask your professor, because sometimes your professor is going to have personal preferences in terms of some of these things as well. So especially when you're writing something for a grade, you want to align yourself with what your professor might be looking for. So there are 5 rhetorical moves of abstracts. What I mean by a move is something that an abstract actually does. Now, I do want to note there are 5 possible rhetorical moves, but not every abstract is going to include all of them. And in fact, number 5 here is the least common move, okay? But this is typically, if you're not sure what you can include in your abstract, this is kind of a list with some questions to help guide you for writing your abstract. And like I said, you do not need to include all 5. Include only the ones that are the most key for understanding your actual study in particular. So for example, move number 1 would include background information, introduction, okay? You might, in move 2, you would talk about the present research, the purpose of the research you're conducting. Number 3 would be talking about the methodology. How did you find the data, or how did you reach your findings of this study? And then number 4 would be the results of your study. And then depending on the study, you might include move number 5, which would be if you're giving any recommendations or if you're going to discuss any implications of your study. So again, number 5 is the least common, and number 2, which is talking about the purpose of the study, and number 4, which is talking about the results or findings of your study, those are the 2 most common. So you can use any combination of these depending on what is most relevant for your specific research that you're working on, okay? So let's look back at our democracy abstract that we just read. And I want you to think about, okay, which of these moves can you find in here? You may not be able to find all of them. And also, there are 5 sentences and 5 moves, but that does not mean that each sentence matches up to each particular move. So I'm just going to give you maybe a minute to read over this abstract again and see what you can find, if you can find each of the moves in here. And again, they may not all exist. So I'll give you maybe 1 minute to read this over, and then we'll talk about it. All right, so can we find an example of move number 1? Okay. So is there an example of any background or introduction information? And if so, what sentence can you find it in? Yeah, so sentence number 1 is definitely an example of background information. I would also argue that possibly sentence number 3, since we're kind of talking about what other studies do or what other studies have done in the past, that is also giving us some background information or information about the situation in which this research exists. So possibly sentence number 1 and sentence number 3 are both giving us some background information about the situation. What about information about this present research and the purpose of this research? Can you see any sentences that do that? Yeah, so this does kind of meet up neatly so far. So we have sentence number 2, which talks about what this study is going to do. Okay. What about methods, any methodology or procedures? Is that included in here? It's hard. We're not given specific methodology information, but we are given some hints about how they're looking at their data. So for example, sentence number 2 says they're using data on infant mortality, although we don't know in what way they're using it. And then in sentence number 4, it says once these and other flaws are corrected. So we do know that they are looking in their data as they are looking at their data in a certain way to correct some of the errors from previous research. So we're not given anything specific about the methodology, but we are given a little bit of a hint in terms of how they're going to organize and interpret their data, which I would argue could be part of a methodology section, just not super specific. What about results and findings? Yeah, absolutely. I would say move number 4, we can find it in our last 2 sentences, 4 and 5. So we have the information about how democracy has little or no effect on the infant and child mortality rates, and then more further information about how democracies spend their money and which groups tend to benefit from that. So I think we definitely have the findings in here. Then do we have anything for move number 5 about recommendations or implications or anything like that? So I know we're running close on time, so I'm just gonna move on and say, I don't really think there's anything in here that I would say is a specific recommendation per se, although you could argue that we can find an implication in number 5, which would be, who the benefits tend to go to. But I would still say that's kind of more in the findings category than an implication category, but I can see an argument for that. So I would say that there probably isn't any true example of move number 5 in this abstract. Okay. All right, let's keep moving. So talking about move number 3, which again was methodology, talking about the method of your study, this has a lot of information and is sometimes really hard to compress. So I will say that unless the method you're using is the most important thing about your study, like if you're using some amazing groundbreaking study design and this study design is what's most important that you want people to take away, generally you'll need to compress any of your methods. So for example, in the one we just read about democracy, we weren't given anything really specific about methodology. We were just given a hint about what their data was and how they interpreted it, but we weren't given anything specific. So we can probably conclude from that that it was a kind of run-of-the-mill data analysis without anything super groundbreaking from it. Okay, so here's an example abstract, and I will try to wrap this up really quickly. So we have sentences 1 and 2 here, which we can read. Increasing globalization is thought to be impacting business communications around the world. Notice that this abstract does have a citation in it. To assess possible impacts in one developing country, we examine contemporary written business communications in Turkey. So here in sentences 1 and 2, we have our background information and we have kind of the purpose or what this present research was about. Then if we move on to sentences 3 and 4, we're talking about the methodology, and notice how long this is. They're only allowed, in this whole abstract, they're only allowed 100 words, which is incredibly short, okay? So if we look at move 3, which is sentences 3 and 4, the primary data used consisted of approximately 300 memoranda and 150 fax messages associated with 4 different Turkish companies selected to represent a range of sectors, sizes, and management styles. Analysis of the primary data was supported by interviews with executives from these 4 companies. That's 50 words. So they're only allowed 100 words, and they've used 50, half of that, talking about their methodology. That doesn't leave you a lot of space to talk about your findings or anything else that you might be wanting to talk about in your abstract. So we have a couple of examples here. This was a group of students or researchers who are working together on writing an alternative, okay? So normally I would let you process these yourself, but I'm just going to give you the answers here since I know we're running short on time. So in one example, we have the primary data consist, oh, it's because this is British, so they're using data plurally, consist of internal and external correspondence from 4 very different Turkish companies. Secondary data comes from interviews with selected executives. So they've cut this down by half. I think that they include all of their important information. They're talking about the internal and external correspondence. They talk about how the 4 different Turkish companies, they are different from one another, because if we look at the original one, it talks about differences in size, differences in management styles, different sectors, okay? So we're kind of encompassing that a little bit, okay? Let's look at the second copy. The main data consists of 300 memoranda and 150 faxes associated with 4 Turkish companies representing a range of different types of enterprise. So this one includes the very specific numbers of how many memoranda, how many faxes, but it doesn't include the follow-up information from the interviews or anything like that. So I would argue that actually the specific number of memoranda and faxes is less important than knowing where all of your data was coming from. So I would say because this one does not include information about the interviews, it's probably not as successful as the first one. And then we have the last one. Internal memoranda and external faxes were collected from 4 Turkish companies of varying sizes. This primary data was supported by secondary interviews. This one has the memoranda and the faxes. It does include the interviews. However, it only highlights one aspect of the Turkish companies. It only says that they are varying sizes, where in fact they were varying in sectors and management styles as well. So it still doesn't fully incorporate, okay? There might be a better version. So of these 3, I think the first one is the best example, but maybe you could take pieces of this. So for example, we can combine number 2 and number 3 and say, instead of Turkish companies of varying sizes, maybe we say different types of enterprise, take that wording, and then maybe we encompass the entire idea. But this does take practice to cut down your abstracts, especially if you're given something really restrictive like 100 words. I've never seen something that short for any of your capstones here at SES or any of your other research you might be doing at SES. Generally, I'm seeing 250 to 300 words. So you have a little more leeway than 100 words, okay? All right, so just to wrap up, so again, I cannot stress enough how much you really need to be reading over example abstracts in your field, because they really do vary in terms of different stylistic choices that you might make. So definitely start paying attention now. If you're not in capstone now, definitely be paying attention now to any journal articles you might be assigned by your professor and paying attention to the abstracts there, taking note of some of the stylistic choices, okay? Oh, and I think that was it. All right, so it wasn't too bad. I'm only 4 minutes over. So I will, as usual, sit tight here to answer any questions that you may have. You can ask the questions in the chat, or you can feel free to unmute yourself, totally up to you. And as usual, if you have to run and make yourself a sandwich, I know I said that every week, if you have to make yourself a sandwich before your 1 o'clock meeting, feel free. So, but I will hang tight for about 5–10 minutes if there are any questions. Yes, this was recorded, and I will be sending the PowerPoint. I do that every week now, since I know that not everybody can make this lunchtime meeting. So if you want to review anything, I know parts of it were pretty dense. This has been recorded, and I will share my slides later this week. All right, I'm going to assume there were no questions. If you're working on a question in the chat, just copy it so that you can paste it over into an email to me. I hope to see you guys in a couple of weeks for the last one. Actually, I think it's next week for our last one, supporting arguments. And yeah, thank you for joining us today. Hold on. Someone's asking a question here. In my thesis, it says state the problem, 100 words. Should I assume this is an abstract? I would not assume that's an abstract, because stating the problem is only one aspect of an abstract. So it's more likely to just be your professor just wants to limit you in how much background information you're giving in this particular aspect. So I would not assume that that's an abstract, because you're really only looking at the problem and not talking about any of your findings or methodology or anything else that fits into an abstract. But also, it never hurts to ask your professor, but I would assume no, that's not an abstract. All right. All right, everybody, have a great afternoon, and I will hopefully see you next week for our last workshop. Again, feel free to email me with any questions. Bye.